I'd like to introduce now our keynote speaker for tonight. I'm so excited to bring her up on stage. Dr. Ellen Kelsey is a professor in the Masters of Environmental Education and Communication at Royal Roads University and is currently a research fellow at the James Cook University in Cairns Institute of Australia. Ellen is currently working at the Monterey Bay Aquarium on a social media project about teens and conservation activism, and she was one of the founders of the #OceanOptimism campaign. I think often when you hear about ocean education, there's a tendency towards doom and gloom, and I'm hoping Ellen's talk tonight brings us all to a greater understanding of the power of positivity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Kelsey, our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Penny. Well, just a pleasure to be here in Halifax. Who knew Halifax was so beautiful? All of you. I'm just thrilled to be here and thrilled to see so much interest in this subject. So thank you very much. And a special thank you to all the conference organizers. How many of you have ever been a conference organizer? Or known a conference organizer? Yeah, it's a daunting task, and I just think it's wonderful to see this kind of turnout. Thank you. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about hope, and I thought, though, because we're talking about oceans and ocean literacy and these great, big, vast subjects, that it might be helpful to start really close to home. Again, is this an object you've ever seen in your everyday life? Has anyone seen one of these? Yeah, if you haven't, there are many in my home, not necessarily with a basket underneath them, but this. And, you know, I think a lot of the time I think to myself, you know, if I could just get my kids to fold their laundry, my husband to fold his laundry, you know, that whole idea that if I could just figure out the magic way to make that happen. And I think oftentimes we think it's how we tell them, you know, if we could just tell them properly. And so I went on Google and I just looked up, you know, getting people to fold their laundry. And here's how it's done. It's an instructional format, and it shows you how to do it. There's content there. And if you do it, you end up with a kid like that at the top. Look how happy that boy is, right? Okay, now truth time. How many of you have ever had that succeed? Yeah, I have not. My daughter is here, looking very neatly like she's folded, but but we don't succeed. And I think it reminds me that a lot of times when we're passionate about something and we want it to happen, we think it's all about the message, about the content. It's almost as if we believe this: if they knew better, they would act better. And that has been a dominant discourse in all kinds of educational activities for years and years and years. And it comes with an idea of sort of a deficit, right? That it's just if we could fill this lack of knowledge up, we would be able to make the changes that we want to see. When we feel strongly about something, right, and we find ourselves saying it over and over and over again, as this person does, you know, and we feel that our message isn't being heard, we tend to move in a direction of urgency, right? And there's no question, and I want to make it really clear, when I'm talking about hope, I am in no way saying that there are not environmental issues that are vast and urgent and need our attention and that are overwhelming. But what I'm trying to say is that we have a discourse of urgency, and when we feel urgent about something, we often feel fearful about it. How many of you feel fearful about the state of the planet? Yeah, it's very scary. It's very scary. We also know that the way that we communicate, or the way that we publish a lot of our science, is in problem analysis, right? We look towards where problems are. And our mainstream journalists tend to project that in a way that also drives urgency and fear around issues. So here we have a headline from the Rolling Stones. Hey, there's some real new ocean advocate back there. Or frightening headlines like this. So I'll just take a moment to say, you know, for yourself sitting here right now, if I were to ask you, how do you feel when you think about the environment? Can you just turn to the person beside you perhaps and just share a moment or two of how you just actually feel when you think about the environment? Yeah, There's a lot of feelings, right? I could hear a lot of conversation. And this is a question I've been asking people, little tiny kids and older people in all kinds of countries and all kinds of places, because we don't ask it very much. We ask a lot about what we think about the environment, but we don't tend as much to ask how we feel about the environment. And as I said, with these kinds of images and these kinds of ideas, those feelings can sometimes take us in this direction, right? They sometimes take us in loving directions. If I were to ask you that question in a different context at a different moment, you might have another response. But there is no question in my experience that when I ask people how they feel, they have a lot of feelings, and they can access those feelings pretty quickly. Did any of you have trouble jumping into that conversation? Yeah, the feelings are there. And so what I've been trying to do is take a look at what is the evidence that's going on around all of this feeling, and what is becoming more and more accessible now is this growing evidence of children and adults feeling overwhelmed and hopeless about the state of the environment. And you'll notice in the research literature coming out of social sciences, and especially out of conservation psychology, more and more different terms trying to capture what are these feelings that are going on. And some very frightening ideas. So my conjecture is that emotions matter. The Australian Psychological Society and the American Psychological Association have both released major reports in recent years about the psychological implications of climate change. We see more and more academic journals coming forward that are looking at what is going on around this emotional landscape and how it relates to how people feel about the environment and how they feel about their own capacity to affect change and the kinds of behaviors we would wish they to take. There's a fellow named Glenn Albrecht who is at in Australia. He's at a university, and what he's been doing is saying, we simply do not have the words to try and articulate the way we feel about some of these environmental issues. And so he's creating a whole new lexicon of language to try and give words to this. Solastalgia is a term that means when you are homesick, but you're homesick and you're still in the same place, but the place itself has really changed. And from that work, what they've been trying to do is look at what are some of these psychoterratic, right, earth-oriented syndromes that come forward from some of those feelings, and those are now moving into the realm of psychological diseases. We know from neuroscience that when we feel fearful, we tend to react really quickly, and we tend to not care very much about the people around us. We tend to shut down socially. And so this concern that people feel so much fear drives us away from the kind of creativity and collective response, which is the very thing that we need to be engendering as a response to these crucial environmental issues. There's a theory called terror management theory, and if we go back to that idea of deficit, if we assume that people just didn't know, so if they knew better, they would act better, it leads us to continuously tell people about problems, right? Because if they could know the urgency of that problem, they would act in a better way. Well, what terror management theory says is that if you already know there's a big problem, and people just keep telling you about what a big problem there is, then you don't tend to respond more. You tend to go the opposite direction. You feel like, look, I've tried everything I can. It's hopeless. I might as well just, you shut down, you tune out. And in terror management theory, in terms of environmental implications, often people go shopping more. They go and they self-medicate by over-consuming, which is exactly what we don't want to have happen, right? That's the last thing we want, is to be driving consumption as a response to our efforts to drive concern around environment. And what we are seeing in the research literature is a growing conversation around this idea of hopelessness among scientists. This is the first time I saw it put forward was in 2010 in a conversation in bioscience, but it's been moving up the agenda. And so for all of these reasons, I think it's essential that we think about the grand narrative that tends to encapsulate the environment, which is gloom and doom. And how do we shift beyond gloom and doom? So one of the ways that I met up with Nancy Knowlton, who is a coral reef biologist, who many of you will know from the Smithsonian Institution. I met her a few years ago when she was doing these. She was hosting what she called Beyond the Obituary sessions at major scientific conferences. And her reason for doing it was that she was noticing a decline in the number of students joining conservation biology fields, and that she felt like she was equipping her students to know, essentially to write the obituaries of nature. And her view was, these conservation science students, what we want to be doing is not working more and more of what's broken, but driving towards what solutions do work and how do you replicate those solutions. So she said, I'll hold these Beyond the Obituary sessions where I invite people who are coming to the conference anyway to just share those pieces of their research where solutions and conservation successes occurred. And she wasn't sure anyone would come, but she was inundated. And she held them in a number of places. So when I heard about that, I met up with her, and we started talking about our mutual interest in moving this narrative beyond doom and gloom. We worked with people like Bill Lawrence, who is a colleague of mine at the Cairns Institute, and he did some of these beginning papers where he was trying to publish more about success stories. I wrote a piece for New Scientist based on Bill Lawrence's work, where we talked about the necessity of opening up that conversation. And in more recent years, I worked with the Rachel Carson Institute for Environment and Society, looking with social scientists and people working in the environmental humanities around how did they feel about gloom and doom, and what are some of the social science and humanities implications for that work. And there's now an online exhibit if you'd like to read any of those letters or contribute your own letter. So in terms of shifting narratives, I think one of the crucial ideas that I would really love to put forward is this idea that stories change. When we talk about gloom and doom, it's as if we are locked in a particular story. And what's really challenging is to know that there is a big problem, but to recognize when improvements happen and things really do go in directions that you didn't expect. And I just wanted to share a few of those with you. So here's one. This is off of At Ocean Optimism that was tweeted back in May. And they're talking about Baja fishermen saving sharks through ecotourism. So ideas around sharks, I was teasing Haley earlier today about Peter Benchley, who many of you will know was very involved in Jaws and has spent many decades since then feeling very terrible about the way people feel about sharks and working very hard to change public perception, right? And public perception around sharks is dramatically changing. Oops, sorry, go this way here. This is I don't know if you have ever seen any of these. These are these time action forward films. Have you ever seen one of these? There are a number online. There's one about, you can follow when atomic bomb testing was done by different countries, and they go year by year by year. And so you can really see in time this, essentially the escalation of the arms race. So Nancy started thinking, what would it look like if we did a time sequence of trying to show how much more work there is around, positive things around the banning of shark finning, around restrictions of shark fishing, different commerce things that are helping sharks. And so she took that vast body of literature and tried to put it together in a fast action film forward. And so this is my plea. If any of you are really good at making film, we need your help. But the data is here. And I just wanted to give you a sense. Let's see if that'll go. And I can't give you a sense. Okay, sorry. So anyway, what you'll see if you were watching that film is this increasing number of things, of initiatives coming forward. Very sorry that that's not playing. We see the the Environmental Resources Institute now charting the global downfall of the plastic bag. Right? That's a story that's changing. And if you look online, again, at the number of initiatives of cities banning single-use plastic bags and countries banning single-use plastic bags and bringing in other initiatives, we're really seeing positive movement in that direction. I was lucky enough to work on writing the scientific brief for George Bush. It was done not for George Bush, it was done for the Pew Global Oceans, Pew Ocean Legacy. And what they realized was that George Bush needed some kind of positive legacy upon leaving office. So they used that political time to say, why not put forward a blue legacy? Why not help George Bush make the world's largest marine protected area as the thing that he would do upon leaving office? And in fact, they succeeded in that. I think that was a very wonderful example of seeing a particular political moment in time and driving an interest of marine protected areas around that timing. And so I was euphoric in 2009 when that actually happened. Sorry, I've got myself backwards here. And I was euphoric again in 2014 when Obama expanded those existing reserves and made them bigger. And our friend Enric Sala, who many of you will know, also a former Pew Fellow, says now that just the proportion of the world's oceans that are protected have doubled in just the last few years. And the Mariana Trench work that I was involved with, the largest protected area in 2009, is now the 8th largest marine protected area. There are many more bigger ones. So we see quite a lot of movement in marine protected areas. I think this one's not going to work either. Should we try it? Okay. So if you get a chance, I'm just going to tell you about this. Big Blue Live. Did any of you watch any of Big Blue Live? Right. So Big Blue Live was an initiative put together by BBC and PBS just last September. And what they did was they said, we were going to try and do a live broadcast from Monterey Bay, which is a wonderful marine protected area that has recovered so much that we feel we can do a live broadcast of just events that are happening in the ocean, and we're going to cover them as they're happening. And this particular clip is of a person seeing a blue whale just spontaneously in the middle of one of these sections. But I want to draw your attention to this number here. More than 2 million views in one day. It was the top watched program of all of BBC programming on that day, more than Downton Abbey. And again, I think this is really important because when we think in terms of, we have to immobilize people's passion for the ocean, I think these are interesting examples that passion exists. And the question is how we create opportunities for it to come forward. Here we are. The last few examples from George Bush and Obama and the growth of marine protected areas all over the world, the fish biomass boosted on average greater than 400% within the last 10 years. So marine protected areas have a huge impact, and they're a story that has really changed. And I think it's a story worth telling. Because part of the impact of that is that we're also seeing another story changing, and that is the story of sustainable seafood. How many of you are aware of sustainable seafood or make an effort? Yeah. In this audience, of course. But we're really not alone. And I think, look at this number of overfished stocks and how that number has changed just since 2000. We know of cases of cod making comebacks in Canada. And again, the specificity, right? Some cod fishery recovering, some not. But the need to talk not about general stories, but about specific stories. Seafood Watch cites dramatic turnaround in rockfish and other West Coast fish. And a lot of that is due to, in the case of seafood, it's due to us. It's due to us as consumers saying, this is something I expect, this is something I want. And the kinds of program like Seafood Watch or the Marine Stewardship Council programs that allow us to quickly see whether a fish is listed at what level and whether we can go out and it's being sustainably caught and whether we can purchase it, right? And so I think this Seafood Watch is a really interesting example because the scientists who are working on Seafood Watch, they have to upgrade their app or their cards, if you have the little cards in your wallet, every 3 months. And they have to do it every 3 months because the stories of what is sustainable change. And they're changing really dramatically because of that demand, consumer demand for sustainable seafood is driving changes in fishing practices. And by changing the card quickly, it shows that response, and that's good for fishers, it's good for the large producers who are purchasing those fish, and it's good for the consumer. We see other examples where this form of technology, we live, I would say, in this age of personalization, right? How many of you have a cell phone? Yeah, and how many of you expect stuff to come to you that really relates to you, right? We live at the age of engagement where we want to be able to contribute to something, and we live in an age of specificity, that this particular stock is being sustainably harvested, and because I know that, I can purchase that. This one is not. This is a photograph from a fish hackathon, which happened just a few months ago. Have any of you ever been in a fish hackathon? Yeah, look, we have fish hackathon folks here. And in those cases, what they're doing is inviting coders and programmers to get together and look at crucial fisheries issues or ocean issues, and then come up with solutions. And one of the things we know around marine protected areas and around fishing in those practices in those areas is that a lot of times people don't even know they're in a marine protected area when they're fishing. Small fishers may not even know they're there. And in this particular case, we see an app being used by a person in the Philippines that was produced at one of these fish hackathons as a way of knowing that. And I do know from a colleague in the Great Barrier Reef that the more they put that kind of technology onto people's hands when they're in the Great Barrier Reef into their phones, and it beeps them when they're actually in the marine protected area so they know they're there, it has a big influence on how they feel about being in the marine protected area and what behaviors they do in that place. And also they are driving and saying, we want to be able to send now back our photos of what we're seeing in the Great Barrier Reef. We want to contribute to your database. We want to be able to show you the mapping that we're doing. And that's really pushing those people who are in charge of looking after those marine protected areas to think in ways that are much more collaborative, much more engaging. Boy, I don't know what's happened. It's like I'm crazy. And the global seafood market, this is from just May 11th, 2016. Global sustainable seafood market hits 11.5 billion. You know, when the Seafood Watch program started at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, it was non-existent. And to see that number in, a decade of work, it's very exciting. So stories change. I think this is another big point, that we aren't the only ones who are actively responding to crisis. I don't know if that's the right word, but to change. And I'd just like to show you a few of these. This is a beautiful place. Have any of you ever gone diving here? Anybody know where this is? This is Bikini Atoll. And this was a place that looked like that. And this is how it looks now, right? That's a pretty dramatic change. It was the site of the largest atomic bomb testing for the US. A number of atomic bombs were exploded there. And now we see a place in certain areas of Bikini Atoll, 85% coral recovery. It's remarkable. And again, I think it's not the story we see almost always. If you Google bikini, that's what you see. So stories change and resilience coming from other species. Here's a wonderful example of resilience and ambiguity. These wolves are living in Chernobyl, and Chernobyl is now the best place in Europe for wolf conservation. Isn't that ironic? It's ironic, it's iconic, it's pretty amazing. So we have these fantastic examples of resilience and ambiguity, and I think that's part of our story changing. We like to talk about things being great and then wrecked. Here's an example where really wonderful things are happening, and yet this is still very much an area affected by nuclear fallout, right? So we have to get more comfortable with ambiguous stories and when we're speaking about change. This is coming from James Cook University. Baby clownfish learn to cope in a high CO2 world. We talk about changing acidity in the oceans, but what we've seen or what these researchers have found is that when baby clownfish are with their parents in a higher acid research test, for some reason the babies cope better and then they do better as adults. They don't yet understand why that is, but this capacity that it isn't all fish affected the same way in these kinds of broad stories, that there are these unusual and things we didn't expect and are worth looking at and talking about. We know of endangered butterflies that when their entire habitat was wiped out, have actually moved to a new habitat and started a new diet. Again, I'm in no way saying don't worry about it all, guys, they'll just move to another habitat and get a new diet. But I don't think it's right that we don't talk about, sorry about the double negative, that there are these examples where things move in directions we didn't expect. And this is a poignant but fascinating example. Gorillas who are in areas where they have been heavily affected by bushmeat and other crises in that environment around civil war. There's a recent example of a young gorilla watching a park ranger disabling a snare and then mimicking and modeling that same behavior and learning to disable a snare and now having taught it to other members of their troop. So again, this agency and capacity that exists within the other than human world, we rarely talk about. We tend to talk about ourselves and what we do, or should do, or don't do. And then this just came out at the end of May. Orcas are the first non-humans whose evolution is driven by culture, looking at genetic differences that have evolved from cultural differences. We know that killer whales that live in different parts of the world have very different cultural behaviors. They tend to eat different food. They hunt in very different ways. They have different social structures. They have different languages. And now this work showing that that cultural difference has moved its way into a very different genetic background. And I'll just move from there. Social networks. So stories change. We're not the only ones actively responding to hope, and social networks. And you probably think I'm talking about people, but I'm not. Social networks, another amazing discovery. These are humpback whales. And anyone know what they're doing? They're bubble netting, that's right. And bubble netting, for those, how many of you know about bubble netting? Look at this great group. Okay, right. So bubble netting is a collective activity, right? Fred Sharp, the researcher who works on them, says that the whales that get together to bubble net in Southeast Alaska, they are not related to each other, and yet they get together, the same groups, 10 to 14 animals, get together every year just to bubble net, and then the rest of the year they don't hang together. So they are coming to do this activity because it works, because when they collectively work like that, they achieve a lot of fish. And he says that the reason that humpbacks have had such a great recovery, higher than we anticipated, even though the oceans are getting noisier and they have more shipping traffic to deal with and all kinds of other toxin problems and overfishing problems, is because they are such good social networkers. So he says if they are in one area, big area for us, and they are catching fish and they're doing a certain technique, humpbacks over here will quickly start doing that technique. He says they're totally grass is always greener types, and they're really picking up on innovation and using that innovation. Very interesting. Social networks in trees. Have any of you seen that wonderful book that was done recently by a German forester? Yeah, Boris. Do you remember his name by any chance? I just can't think of it, but I can send it to you. Talking about this work, a lot of this is coming from a UBC researcher, and what she's been looking at is what some people call a world wood net. I can't even say that. Forget it. Anyway, but the idea is that we have mother trees. I just love these terminologies. And these mother trees are connected to many other trees around them and many other plants around them through their mycorrhizal fungal networks that join between the roots of the trees. And that when a tree is dying, it actively sends its nutrients into that surrounding net. And that there is this movement of nutrients so that younger trees are getting more chemical energy coming from older trees when they are smaller. And that fungus, this is one of my favorite things, the fungus on teenage maple trees is different than the fungus on adult maple trees. So we have this entire complexity of communication systems happening between trees. And this work that I just wanted to point out here shows that when you leave trees, and I think this is really important from a forestry standpoint and also from a recovery after crisis standpoint, after typhoons and those sorts of activities, when you leave the trees in place, they have that capacity to direct their energy, and foresters have seen a more rapid recovery of forests when those trees are left with that web. Okay, this picture, does anyone know what this is? This is a map of Europe, and those are all tweets. And that's just one 24-hour tweet. The colors are language, right? So what do we know about social? Sorry, honestly, if I use it one way, it's going that way. We know that in mainstream media, bad news tends to dominate, right? In social media, good news travels faster than bad. It's going to do it. So you're just going to be drunk along with me. So I'm not drunk. Sorry, I just meant I meant the way it was weaving. I apologize. So when Nancy Knowlton, the woman I mentioned from the Smithsonian Institute, who was doing the Beyond the Obituaries, and Heather Coldaway, who is the global head of marine and freshwater conservation for the Zoological Society of London, the three of us discovered over time that we had a really similar interest in shifting this narrative in ways that are based on science. We decided we would try and change the access to these kinds of solutions because they were really hard to find. And so we decided we would just put together a hashtag called, hashtag Ocean Optimism. And we did that 2 years ago yesterday, and it's already had 59 million tweets. And I don't know, have any of you been on hashtag Ocean Optimism? Yeah, I would really encourage you to take a look because it's amazing how much, so looking at me, you know that I am not driving 59 million tweets, right? Sadly, it's obvious. It's not me. It's because there is such a capacity of interesting examples of hopeful conservation solutions out there. And I think this is so successful because people are responding to a place where they can share them. I'm jumping now. There we are. The other reason I think it's been so successful in sharing is because of this research that was just done 2 years ago. This was a very contentious piece of research that was done by Facebook and Cornell University. And what they were looking at was manipulating Facebook posts for positive or negative news so they could see how contagious emotions were online. Because in communications research, we know that emotions are contagious face-to-face. Like if I'm really upset all the time, how many of you have a coworker like that, right? It's contagious. But it turns out that emotions are also contagious online. And I think that's part of the reason that ocean optimism has moved in that way. I think from an ocean literacy standpoint too, when we're thinking about what makes things contagious, it's not just emotions, but it turns out from other work that it's things that are highly viral are because they're curious, there's amazement, there's interest, there's astonishment, and we worry sometimes about, if we're talking about small fish at the bottom of the ocean, that's just not going to appeal, right? It's not going to go viral. We won't be able to communicate in those kinds of formats. But it turns out, look at the number of views of this anglerfish video. That's 14 million views. How many of you have seen that one? You've got to go look at it. Honestly, it's unbelievable. You're supposed to be watching these things. And again, we're in this period of access, right? The capacity to be able to show the ocean in such remarkable ways as this anglerfish. This came out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And it's incredible footage of a tiny animal rarely seen and was so widely shared. So what I wanted to share with you is this idea that emotions are really tied to motivation. And we want to engage people. That's what we're all about, right? So emotion, how we feel about things, and motivation, why we do things, creates this whole world in which we decide whether or not we can take action. And this pessimistic framing or optimistic framing turns out through other research that's done in terms of looking at emotional learning, that we can affect people's frames. We can help them to develop more optimistic ways of looking at things. Not only is optimism contagious, our feelings contagious, but also social environmental learning approaches enable us to create the kinds of contexts where people are more able to develop optimistic viewpoints, so they don't feel like things are hopeless. Because hopelessness also ties to helplessness. And when we feel helpless, we really don't feel like we have any agency or any capacity to act. Hope is a goal-directed activity. So what we want to do as educators is help people with developing the pathways they need and the motivation to use those pathways, the sense that they have the agency to really be able to enact a change. This is a beautiful example. Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is this idea that I can really do this thing, that I believe in my capacity to do it. And in this particular case, this is a project that Heather worked along with in the Philippines. They've been doing a number of mangrove projects for a number of years. And when the typhoon went through a few years ago, what they discovered was that people in the work areas who had been involved in those mangrove reproducing sites actually went in and were trying to restore the mangrove even before they were restoring their homes, because of this recognition of the importance of mangroves, the resilience of mangroves to typhoon, and also how dependent those mangroves are for the fishes that they're depending upon. So these stories of resilience, when people are there doing these things, are the stories we need to hear. And I wanted to show you this one. There's a wonderful website and book called Defiant Gardens, and it looks at people who, isn't that a wonderful quote? When we see nobody is around, we run in, plant, and escape. The supervisor of Baghdad Parks, right? There are examples all over of people who care as much about the ocean or as much about the environment as you do, and who are taking action because they feel that self-efficacy, because they believe they have the potential to make some difference. There's a distinguishing part between hope that I think is quite useful to consider. We often think about hope in terms of the possibility of a better future, right? We can imagine a better future. But there are points in our lives where we can't imagine a better future. And if you look into the work of hospice, the psychology around the hospice movement, around people near the end of their lives, hope is not a question then about the possibility of a better future. It becomes much more a question of a meaningful present. What really matters to me now? What meaningful contributions are I making in my life at this moment? And I think for people when they're feeling truly overwhelmed about the state of the planet, that if we only talk about the possibility of a better future, that might not be where they are situated. And it might be that the engagement that they're doing with the environment right now is enough to think about hope in those terms of a very meaningful present, or hope as the possibility of a better future. And I put this up as well because the hope literature is as diverse as the biodiversity literature. You know, there's so many different philosophical, psychological, educational stances that we can take around hope, all of which offer something in shifting this narrative beyond doom and gloom. I just wanted to end with a point about collective hope. Because so often in environmental work, we have historically talked mostly about individuals and individual behavior change. But there's been a real sea change. I like you would like a sea change, towards thinking much more about collectives of people. The Fish Hackathon works not because one guy made a program, but because a whole community of people with knowledge who care about the oceans got together and started trying to think about what ways could their technological skills come to play in this world. Ocean optimism is not because I'm a master tweeter. It's because, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, including the Vatican, now tweet #ocean optimism. It's a collective response. And if we have that collective response around hope, it's a very powerful thing. Because if we think again about emotions being contagious, that hope can catch and it can move because the ideas that it's showing are substantial themselves, right? So hope substantiates and generates further hope, which then catches on and then moves forward and puts us in a place where the successes that really do exist, that we do know work, things like marine protected areas. And I know marine protected areas, there's a healthy debate about in what ways, in which places, for what impact. But the idea of them and the importance of them and the importance of that debate within them is not diminished by the debate. It's that we want to look at solutions and then help them reproduce. And this idea of collective is a very important part of that. So we are a collective here today. And what I would really love to leave you with is this question. How can we use this gathering, this time that we've all decided to use our non-renewable life moments to be here, how do we spread wild, contagious hope for the oceans together? How do we do that? And I just wanted to leave you with this image. Can you see this guy? Okay, so Phil Toledano he's a photographer, he's an artist. And this particular series he was doing, he's a portrait photographer. This guy is gaming, and the photographer is right in front of the screen at the moment that he is about to make an epic win. And if you look at his face, there's actual research, you can tell by his face that he's about to make an epic win, which is an outcome so extraordinarily positive you had no idea it was even possible. And there are people working in the gaming world who now use game theory and this whole aspect to look at how do they engage people in real world issues. Now, I'm not a gamer, but that face is what I want for ocean literacy. I want that feeling of like, I could not believe that was possible. And I will tell you, as a person who, watching the recovery of Monterey Bay has been one of the most moving experiences of my life. I have to say that. I've only lived there for 18 years, and I know that many of you are not much older than that, but at my time in life, it's not a long time. And I can tell you that Big Blue Live could not have been done in Monterey Bay when I moved there, because there just wasn't the same number of whales, and that is truly a change. And the recovery of that bay is a story worth sharing. And so when 2 million viewers got that same exposure to what it's like to see something that's recovered and recovering, that's a pretty wonderful, wonderful thing. And I looked like that. In fact, I wish I could tell you that was me, but it's not. So I'm going to stop there and ask you if there are questions, challenges. I am very much a person who believes in knowing what pieces work and what pieces you'd like to know more about or would change. So feel free to tell me things you really didn't like or that you would like to hear differently, because I would appreciate that too. Questions, ideas? I'm just going to go to someone else first. Thank you.